Friends, what's going on? So recently I stumbled across a pretty famous quote and it goes like this. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. Now you probably heard this before, right? So originally it is credited to Albert Einstein. He's just one of those public figures that was, of course, a genius, smart, intelligent, and a lot of times he just gets credited for things he didn't say, or maybe he quoted someone else and someone didn't give that quote to the original person. Why am I saying this? Well, that quote was originally created by an American writer, author, Rita Mae Brown in 1981 or 82, just from my simple research. But what does that have to do with anything? What does that have to do with this video? What made me, make that connection or even bring that up? I'll tell you why. She had another quote while I was researching, and this quote stuck with me. And that was, "Good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment." I love this quote as it pertains to my street photography journey. If I'm not out creating, making, questioning, documenting my work, how will I know if I'm actually getting better? So there's 3 techniques that I'm gonna try to incorporate into this video, share with you. Hopefully you get some value from that, but they've been working for me and I also wanna get better at them, so might as well talk about them. So number 1 is layering, the practice or the technique of layering. Number 2, the technique of making my images, my compositions more abstract. And number 3 is the technique of cropping. 3 techniques that I'm incorporating into my daily photography routine to nurture this growth through experience. So the idea of layering your images can have a lot of meanings, but specifically what I'm trying to do is break it down into 3 parts. So your foreground, your background, and your middle ground. How those 3 grounds work together. So that's what the focus will be when we're talking about layering today. And a quick thing to remember, I'm using a 40mm focal length. It's on the Ricoh GR3X. Now you might be at a different focal length, which will play into the storytelling and the layering that you're doing. So just keep in mind if you're shooting on an 85, a 28, 16, it doesn't really matter what focal length, but that's going to play a role for sure in your storytelling and your layering. So if we look at this first image here, and it doesn't always land, you don't always have 3 grounds covered, but that's the idea, that's the concept. And since we're shooting in real time, we just hope that we're telling a story that's unique or different, or there's something that feels good about it. I think it's more of a feeling. So we got our foreground here, this lady right here, and then our middle ground is kind of this horizon line that's going through to keep our focus on our main subject, right? So that's our middle ground. And then we have this gentleman in the background. He's gonna be our background. Now, that seems simple for me to write that right now, but that's a lot of practice and it's not perfect. What ends up happening most of the times, I would say, is the image, the scene felt special, and then hoping later that I told some stories. Okay, so when we look at this image here, there's a few stories being told. Again, these are layers. Another tip or something to keep in mind is if you have a foreground story, then the image is already a win, okay? In my eyes anyways, but it doesn't mean it's guaranteed, but it just helps dictate. Even if you don't have other stories in other layers or in other grounds, this is a good starting point. So you got your foreground, your middle ground you could say is this composition right here, this part of the scene, right? And that's middle. And then of course in the background, you have 2 stories going on here, right? So 3 stories, right? So there's so many things. It says no exit, and then you have your subject over there. Let's just take all this off for a second. Okay, so there you are. You have at least 3 stories, foreground, middle ground, background, and it starts to become, you start to get curious and say, what is going on here? Like, is this lady looking at me? She's leaning on this pole, something's going on in the background. How can there be somebody at the bus stop if I don't see them in the foreground? So there's a lot of stories there, and I think it does add to the image. So I was on Wikipedia and they vaguely define abstract photography as a means of depicting a visual image that does not have an immediate association with the object world and that has been created through the use of photography equipment, processes, and/or materials. Okay, so based off of that interpretation of abstract photography, how do we incorporate that into our street photography? Well, I think words like reflections, shapes, shadows, shutter speed times, pieces of people, silhouettes, double exposures, these are all words that will help create abstract images and will help us stay focused on not doing traditional street photography and getting those traditional compositions. But I think the most important word would be imagination. That is going to free you from these constraints that we've already created for ourselves. And sometimes they do well by us because they are fundamentals, but we really want to step outside of that box and try and do something different with these new techniques. Let's start with this one right here. This is the bike crossing. I knew I wanted to shoot this scene at this sidewalk, but I wasn't sure. It was about 15 minutes of waiting just to see if someone would come because I knew we had pretty good light. This gentleman was riding straight and then he decided to turn. And when he turned, it just changed my frame, but I was stubborn. I'm like, I'm not moving. It ended up being a story where the subject's head is just not there, but I felt it complemented the image. So I was happy about that outcome. Here's a more traditional type of abstract street shot. If you stare at his feet long enough, it's almost like his feet are facing this way. Like this foot could potentially be looking at us. That's just what my eye does. And with the pants being so dark, that I can actually swap back and forth with that feeling. This pole is great. It's not fully black. It's kind of like a dark gray, which helped make this gentleman stand out. And yeah, there's a lot of darker spots that help tell this story. Abstract. Let the viewer figure it out. Now let's talk about cropping. So number one, give yourself permission to crop. A lot of times we think about the focal length that we just shot in, and that is the composition. But we really have to think outside of that box. How do we do that? We got to crop. I like to shoot 1-to-1 ratio or crop in 1-to-1 ratio, square. Most cameras are 4:3 just by default or 3:2 by default. So go into your settings or don't go into your settings, just shoot as you see. And then later in Lightroom or whatever you use, Capture One, it doesn't really matter. When you're editing, you might have to crop a lot, cropping more than you've ever cropped to get that abstract feel. Remember, we're trying abstraction here, something that you can't really put your finger on. When I think about it in real time, it's actually a feeling. We want our images to feel like something. Let the audience decide what the story is. You just give them the feels. And cropping can get tricky because you don't want to overcrop, especially if you didn't shoot in RAW. Now you're losing actual pixels if you're shooting digital, but that might be part of the grit. Like I like gritty. Street Soul is about like that gritty, warm feeling that takes you somewhere. It's like you're in a theater with those lights down low. So if that is my end goal, then cropping is not a big deal to me. Grain is not a big deal to me. A few pixels missed, not a big deal. However, keep that in mind when you're shooting, because if you're at 35 and then now you're zooming in and cropping to, I don't know, a 1-to-1 ratio, and it looks like you shot on an 85, make sure your settings are forgiving so when you're in post and you're doing all this cropping, it's not losing quality to your overall storytelling. So let's look at a couple of images that I'm pretty proud of as of right now that started out pretty wide and then I cropped in because I wanted to tell a different story, a more unique story, but ultimately a story that I connect with. Let's break down this last image right here. Now let's go back to the beginning just to see how I got here. And so here's the import, black and white. Absolutely love this frame. The energy, the motion of the foreground subject, stuff going on in the back, okay? However, I didn't feel like there was a focus. But again, if you see this shot in real time, you can see that I'm feeling something, so I just press the shutter. And I think that's half of the battle when it comes to cropping. What did you do in camera to make your job easier later? So if we look at this and we follow through, the first thing you can see I did was right away cropped. And then slowly, as we go through it, you can see I'm trying to make her the focus of the story, and that's just through editing. See these little tweaks that I'm doing. clarity, exposure, contrast. Ultimately, look at that. That last tweak in the end, in a square format, look, I make her the star. Now, if we go back to what we were talking about, that is my foreground, middle ground, background. I've got my abstraction, which is the motion. And then, of course, in the end, I have the crop square to make her the story, make her the hero. All right, so there you have it. That's the 3 elements. Let's wrap this up, but I hope you enjoyed that little segment. All right, so question of the day, you know how we do it here. Is abstract photography too abstract for you? Is it a distraction? Is it something that you're just not interested? Or is it something that you've tried but you don't really incorporate it into your daily routine? Let me know your thoughts on abstract street photography. All right, so obviously if I am creating a video on abstract street photography, layering, cropping, any of that, then I'm obviously a fan of the process and the results. Abstract street photography is definitely something that I've been doing subconsciously, but now I want to make it as a focus to help propel my work to new levels and open up my curiosity, something I've always struggled with since I was a kid. All right, so hopefully you took something away from this video that is tangible that you can actually use with your street photography. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. As always, I love the conversation. I appreciate you all. And until the next video, stay creative and believe in yourself. Peace.